Nobody noticed. That's the part that keeps bothering me. Not the headlines about artificial intelligence, not the arguments over semiconductor sanctions, not even the endless debates about whether China can overtake the United States technologically. What slipped under the radar was something much quieter. A growing number of scientists simply started leaving. Not in dramatic waves, not with press conferences, not with political speeches. Just one researcher at a time, one laboratory at a time, one airport departure gate at a time. And that's precisely why it matters. When a factory closes, everyone notices. When a stock market crashes, it dominates television screens. But when a leading materials scientist decides to move from Boston to Shenzhen, or a battery researcher chooses Shanghai over Silicon Valley, the consequences don't show up immediately. They arrive years later. In the products we buy, in the industries we lead, in the technologies we no longer control. Because modern economic power isn't built from oil wells or steel mills alone. It's built from human brains. And the uncomfortable reality is that some of the world's most valuable brains are increasingly finding reasons to build their futures somewhere else. A report from Harvard's Belfer Center found that China has dramatically increased its ability to attract and retain elite scientific talent over the past decade. At the same time, surveys among international researchers show growing concerns about immigration uncertainty, visa restrictions, and funding instability in the United States. Those may sound like bureaucratic issues. They're not. They're strategic issues. Because every breakthrough begins as a person sitting in a laboratory, staring at a problem nobody else has solved. And here's the question that sits underneath this entire story. What happens when the country that dominated science for nearly a century stops being the obvious destination for the world's best researchers? We're going to come back to that. First, it's worth remembering how unusual America's position really was. For most of modern history, talent moved toward the United States almost automatically. A physicist in Germany wanted to work in America. An engineer in India wanted to study in America. A mathematician in China wanted a position in America. The destination barely required explanation. The laboratories were better funded. The universities were stronger. The salaries were higher. The opportunities seemed endless. By the late 20th century, the United States had created something extraordinary. It wasn't just producing talent. It was importing talent from every corner of the planet and turning that talent into economic growth. The system became so successful that many Americans started treating it as a law of nature. As if the smartest people would always come, as if they had no alternatives, as if global competition for talent didn't exist. History tends to punish assumptions like that. Meanwhile, something significant was happening across the Pacific. In 2008, China launched the 1,000 Talents program. The initiative wasn't simply about bringing researchers home. It was part of a much larger effort involving universities, research institutes, provincial governments, and state-backed funding programs. The objective was straightforward: acquire expertise, build domestic capability, reduce dependence on foreign innovation. And unlike many government initiatives that generate impressive reports and disappointing outcomes, China backed this ambition with enormous resources. Research funding expanded, laboratories multiplied, graduate programs exploded in size. Entire scientific ecosystems were built in fields ranging from quantum computing to advanced batteries. There was a dry joke circulating among some researchers during the 2000s. America published reports explaining why China was becoming a scientific competitor. China responded by funding another laboratory. The joke was funny because it contained a grain of truth. Yet this story isn't as simple as China wins, America loses. That's the version that generates easy headlines. Reality is more complicated. Many scientists still prefer American universities. The United States remains home to world-class institutions, unmatched venture capital networks, and a culture that rewards breakthrough thinking. The problem isn't that America has suddenly become weak. The problem is that the gap has narrowed. And when the gap narrows, decisions become harder. A young researcher weighing 2 job offers no longer sees one obvious choice and one backup option. Increasingly, they're comparing 2 serious opportunities. That shift may sound small. It isn't. Because the most important competition between great powers isn't over territory. It's over where ambitious people decide to spend the most productive years of their lives. And one particular scientist's decision, a case that receives surprisingly little attention outside academic circles, helps reveal just how much the landscape has changed. In 2021, a scientist named Chang Zhang made a decision that would have attracted enormous attention 20 years ago. Today, it barely registers outside specialized academic circles. Zhang is one of China's leading battery researchers. His work focuses on lithium metal batteries, a technology many researchers believe could significantly increase energy density compared to current lithium-ion systems. Instead of building his career abroad permanently, he remained deeply integrated into China's rapidly expanding research ecosystem. His story isn't unique, and that's exactly the point. For decades, the assumption was that the world's most ambitious scientists would eventually gravitate toward American laboratories. Many still do, but an increasing number no longer feel they have to. The difference between the best option and a good option can reshape entire industries over time. Think about what happens when a brilliant 25-year-old researcher graduates with expertise in semiconductor materials. 30 years ago, the path was fairly predictable. Graduate school in America. Research position in America, startup, laboratory, or corporate career in America. Today, that same researcher might receive offers from institutions in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, Singapore, Zurich, or Seoul. Competition exists in a way it didn't before. Talent markets eventually behave like every other market. When alternatives improve, loyalty weakens. This becomes especially important in fields where scientific breakthroughs directly influence economic power. Take batteries. China didn't become dominant in electric vehicle supply chains because someone in Beijing made a speech. Thousands of researchers spent years solving difficult engineering problems. Universities trained specialists. Companies commercialized discoveries. Investors funded scaling. Factories expanded production. One link reinforced another. By the time many Western policymakers realized how much battery manufacturing had shifted toward China, much of the underlying scientific ecosystem was already there. The factories were simply the visible result. The real foundation had been built years earlier inside laboratories. Semiconductors tell a similar story. Most public discussion focuses on export controls, sanctions, and advanced manufacturing equipment. Those factors matter. But chip making ultimately depends on people. A lithography machine doesn't innovate by itself. A fabrication plant doesn't discover new materials independently. Scientists do. Engineers do. Research teams do. The machine is only as capable as the people operating and improving it. That's why China spent years expanding STEM education on a scale that is difficult for many Western observers to fully appreciate. According to data from various education and labor studies, China graduates several times more engineers annually than the United States. Quantity isn't everything. Quality matters enormously. Still, scale creates options. A larger pool increases the likelihood of producing exceptional researchers. It also increases resilience. If one project fails, another team can continue. If one company struggles, another can absorb talent. The system becomes harder to disrupt. Of course, critics argue that scientific creativity cannot simply be manufactured through scale. There's truth in that. Many of the world's most influential discoveries still emerge from environments that encourage intellectual freedom, risk-taking, and unconventional thinking. America remains exceptionally strong in those areas. The entrepreneurial culture surrounding places like Silicon Valley is still difficult to replicate. Venture capital remains deeper. Startup ecosystems remain stronger. Universities continue attracting elite researchers from around the world. If this were only a competition of scientific institutions, the United States would still hold formidable advantages. But the conversation changes when immigration enters the picture. A researcher can love American universities and still hesitate because of visa uncertainty. A scientist can admire American innovation while worrying about whether family members can remain in the country. An engineer can build a company in California while wondering whether immigration paperwork might derail long-term plans. These aren't ideological concerns, they're practical ones. Researchers make career decisions the same way everyone else does. They compare opportunities, they compare stability, they compare futures. One former university administrator described it bluntly: uncertainty is itself a competitor. That observation stayed with me. Because nations often think they're competing through policies, subsidies, and technology programs, sometimes they're competing through predictability. A laboratory doesn't only need brilliant scientists, it needs scientists who can confidently plan 5, 10, or 15 years ahead. China recognized this reality earlier than many people realize. The country's strategy wasn't merely to attract talent, it was to build enough scientific infrastructure that talented people wouldn't feel compelled to leave in the first place. And in several critical sectors, that strategy is producing results. Yet, there's a twist developing beneath the surface. Because if you look closely at the data, the most interesting question is no longer whether China is attracting more scientists. It's why some American scientists are beginning to consider moving in the opposite direction. And that changes the story completely. There's a statistic that rarely makes headlines. China now produces more scientific papers than any other country on Earth. In several fields, including material science, chemistry, engineering, and energy technologies, it isn't merely publishing more research. Increasingly, it's producing some of the most cited work as well. A decade ago, critics could dismiss much of this output as quantity over quality. That argument has become harder to make. The reason matters. Scientific leadership isn't measured by a single breakthrough. It's measured by whether breakthroughs keep happening year after year. A nation can get lucky once, it can't get lucky thousands of times. Yet this is where the story becomes more complicated than either side wants to admit. Because scientific influence isn't the same thing as scientific dominance. The United States still possesses advantages that don't show up neatly in publication databases. Many of the world's most influential startups are American. Many transformative technologies still emerge from American universities. The venture capital ecosystem remains vastly deeper than anything China has built. When researchers discover something promising, America is often better at turning that discovery into a company worth billions. That's not a small advantage. It's one of the reasons Silicon Valley remains Silicon Valley. So if America still leads in commercialization, why worry about talent migration at all? Because research ecosystems operate on long timelines. The consequences of today's decisions often appear 10 or 20 years later. A scientist relocating in 2026 might influence technologies that won't reach consumers until the late 2030s. The effects are delayed. And delayed problems are notoriously easy for politicians to ignore. There's another reason this matters. Innovation isn't additive, it's cumulative. A single exceptional researcher can train dozens of graduate students. Those students train others. Laboratories form around expertise. Companies emerge around laboratories. Entire industries grow around companies. One person becomes a network. One network becomes an ecosystem, and ecosystems are incredibly difficult to rebuild once they've shifted elsewhere. Remember the question from earlier, what happens when America stops being the automatic destination? The answer isn't immediate decline. The answer is competition, real competition. For perhaps the first time in generations, American institutions are being forced to persuade talented scientists rather than simply expecting them to arrive. That distinction sounds subtle. It isn't. Historically, many elite researchers viewed moving to the United States as the obvious next step. Today, some are asking a different question. Why leave? That may be the most significant change of all. A Chinese AI researcher working in Beijing can access world-class computing resources. A battery scientist in Shenzhen can collaborate with major manufacturers nearby. A quantum physicist in Hefei can work within one of the largest quantum research programs on Earth. The opportunity cost of staying home has fallen dramatically, and that's before considering the reverse flow. Because something unexpected has started appearing in surveys, academic discussions, and industry hiring patterns. A small but noticeable number of foreign researchers are choosing China. Not because they dislike America, not because they're making a political statement, because the projects are interesting, because the funding exists, because the facilities are modern, because the opportunities look real. That's the reversal many observers missed. The debate was supposed to be about whether Chinese scientists would continue leaving for the West. Instead, we're beginning to see examples of global talent moving toward China as well. Not in overwhelming numbers, not yet, but enough to matter. A few years ago, some American policymakers assumed export controls alone would slow China's technological rise. That assumption underestimated something important. Technology isn't only hardware, it's people. A nation can restrict machinery exports. It can limit access to advanced tools. What it cannot easily control is where talented individuals decide to work. People are far more mobile than factories, and unlike manufacturing equipment, they bring creativity with them. This doesn't mean America is losing the scientific race. I don't think the evidence supports that conclusion. In fact, I'd argue many commentators make the opposite mistake by underestimating America's resilience. The United States still attracts extraordinary talent. Its universities remain magnets for ambitious researchers. Its startup culture remains difficult to replicate. Its ability to connect science, capital, and entrepreneurship remains exceptional. But resilience isn't invincibility. The danger isn't that America suddenly wakes up one morning and discovers China has surpassed it in every field. History rarely works that way. The danger is gradual erosion, tiny decisions, small shifts, individual researchers choosing one opportunity over another, year after year. Most people won't notice it happening until they do. And by then, the scoreboard often reflects choices made long ago. Which brings us to the question policymakers in Washington increasingly face. If China has become a stronger destination for scientists, what exactly makes America the better destination going forward? The answer may determine far more than academic rankings. It may determine who builds the technologies that shape the next generation of economic power. The easiest way to misunderstand this story is to think it's about China winning and America losing. That's not what the evidence shows. The United States remains one of the most innovative countries on Earth. Its universities still dominate global rankings. Its venture capital system continues to fund ideas that most countries wouldn't touch. The world's brightest students still dream of studying at MIT, Stanford, Caltech, and dozens of other American institutions. None of that disappears overnight. But history isn't usually decided by who is strongest today. It's often decided by who adapts fastest when conditions change. And the conditions have changed. For nearly 70 years, America benefited from a remarkable advantage. It didn't just educate talented people. It attracted talented people from everywhere else. That created a self-reinforcing cycle. Scientists came because the opportunities were unmatched. The opportunities became unmatched because scientists kept coming. Simple, powerful, difficult to replicate. The question facing Washington isn't whether America can still attract talent. It clearly can. The question is whether it can remain the most attractive destination in a world where researchers have more choices than ever before. Because China isn't trying to copy the United States anymore. That's the development many analysts missed. A decade ago, Beijing's objective was catching up. Today, in fields like batteries, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, quantum research, and artificial intelligence, the goal is increasingly to lead. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't, but it no longer behaves like a country waiting for permission to compete. And that changes the strategic equation. My view is straightforward. The biggest threat to American scientific leadership is not Chinese funding, Chinese universities, or Chinese laboratories. It's complacency. It's assuming talented people will always choose America, because they always have. History offers very few examples where that assumption ended well. My prediction is that the next decade won't produce one dominant scientific superpower. Instead, we'll see a far more competitive world where talent flows in multiple directions. America will remain a giant. China will continue climbing. Other countries will become increasingly important players. And in that environment, the nations that win won't necessarily be the ones spending the most money. They'll be the ones that make ambitious people feel they have a future there. Because every technological revolution starts in the same place: a laboratory, a notebook, a question nobody has answered yet. And increasingly, that question can be asked in more places than ever before. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and stick around. The next big geopolitical competition may not be fought over territory, trade routes, or even chips. It may be fought over where the smartest people decide to build their lives.